Oh, you're here. Good. I was hoping for company. You see, I've got stories, dark ones, chilling ones, the kind that keep you up at night. Mythical creatures, curses, horrors you can't escape. Shall we begin? Don't worry, I won't bite. Much.
There is an old Buddhist teaching. If you take a life, your own life will be taken in turn. Many dismiss this as mere superstition, but some stories are so chilling that they make even skeptics pause. This is one of those stories, one that has been whispered through generations. On a certain year in the Qing dynasty, in a small town in Jiangsu province, the air was filled with the piercing cries of pigs. A flash of steel, a muffled scream. Wu's razor-sharp knife slit the pig's throat in one clean motion. Blood gushed out like a crimson river, pooling in the drainage trench of his slaughterhouse. Wu was the most well-known butcher in town, renowned for his skill. His cuts were quick and precise, his hand unwavering. Every morning, local vendors would gather outside his shop, waiting for their fresh cuts of pork. At the entrance of his slaughterhouse sat a large wooden barrel, filled to the brim with warm, freshly drained pig's blood, ready to be sold. But Wu hadn't always been a butcher. His father had been a farmer, struggling to make ends meet. Eventually, desperation led him to the slaughter trade, and Wu, growing up amidst the stench of blood and the cries of dying animals, naturally followed in his footsteps. By the time he took over the family business, his ancestral knife had already slaughtered thousands of animals. The old folks in town often whispered, "Butchers don't live long, and their children rarely survive to adulthood." Wu, however, never believed in such things. He mocked those superstitions, often joking as he worked. Whenever he slaughtered a pig, he would slap its head and say with a chuckle, "Don't scream so loud. Maybe next life you'll come back as a human." The bound pigs, their eyes filled with terror, would let out pitiful grunts as if pleading for mercy. But Wu only laughed. With a swift motion, the knife fell. The blood ran red. At first, it seemed like just another ordinary day at the slaughterhouse. But soon, people started noticing strange things happening around Wu's shop. No matter how much he scrubbed, the stench of blood never faded. At night, eerie sobbing sounds echoed from his courtyard, like pigs crying in the dark. Stray dogs and wild cats gathered outside his shop at night, howling at something unseen. One day, a Buddhist monk passed by, pausing at the entrance. He sighed, shaking his head. "The killing here is too heavy. The energy of death lingers. This place will see misfortune soon." Wu scoffed, wiping his knife clean. "Monks love talking nonsense. Karma, retribution, ha! If that were true, I'd have been dead long ago." Little did he know, the wheels of karma had already begun to turn. When Wu turned 40, disaster struck. It began with his wife. That day, Wu was in the middle of butchering a cow when one of his workers ran in, breathless and frantic. "Boss Wu, something's wrong. Your wife, she's not going to make it." Wu dropped his blood-stained knife and rushed home. On the bed lay his wife, her lips pale, her breath weak. Her trembling hands reached for him, her eyes filled with something unsaid. Then, with a faint sigh, she was gone. Wu stood motionless, staring at her lifeless body, his mind blank. The next morning, he picked up his knife and went back to work, as if nothing had happened. The townsfolk whispered, shaking their heads. That butcher's heart must be made of stone. But Wu knew better. That night he heard her voice. As he lay in bed, an eerie whisper drifted into his ear, a soft murmur, like his wife's voice, or perhaps something else. He dismissed it as his imagination, and so he continued his slaughter. But fate was far from done with him. That same year, his only daughter fell gravely ill. One evening, without warning, she stopped breathing, silent, still, lifeless. Wu felt a flicker of fear. The old folks in town whispered louder now. "It's the butcher's curse. He has no future generations." But Wu refused to believe in such things. It was just bad luck. Determined, he remarried, taking in a younger wife. This time he was desperate for a son. He burned incense at temples, spent fortunes on prayers, even vowed to slaughter fewer pigs if heaven would grant him an heir. And finally, the heavens answered. The following year, his wife bore him a son. Wu was ecstatic. That day, he slaughtered 3 pigs in celebration, hosting a grand feast. Amid the laughter and toasts, someone whispered, "Wu, are you sure this child will survive?" Wu scowled, waving the thought away. "Rubbish. The gods gave me this child. He will live." But the joy didn't last. Before the baby turned 3 months old, he was found dead in his cradle, his tiny body cold, his mouth and nose oozing dark blood. That night, Wu lost his mind. He fell to his knees before his son's corpse, his fists pounding his own chest, his screams tearing through the night. Why? 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 But the heavens gave no answer. Wu sat outside in the courtyard that night, staring blankly into the darkness. The wind howled, whispering through the trees. The town was eerily silent. Then, from the backyard, he heard it, a low, guttural cry. It was the sound of pigs, crying. Wu's breath hitched. He turned, scanning the empty yard. Nothing was there. Yet the cries grew louder, more desperate, as if countless pigs were wailing in agony from beyond the grave. He clutched his chest, feeling a chill creep up his spine. Something was wrong. And this was only the beginning. That night, Wu finally succumbed to exhaustion and fell asleep. But the moment he closed his eyes, he was dragged into a nightmare. He found himself standing in the middle of his slaughterhouse. The air reeked of blood, thick, metallic, suffocating. Beneath his feet, the floor was not just wet but drenched in a sea of clotted red. All around him lay piles of dead pigs, cows, and sheep, their bodies twisted, their eyes wide open in an eerie, lifeless stare. Then, "Ah!" A horrific scream shattered the silence. Wu turned in horror as a butchered pig suddenly stood up, its belly still split open, intestines spilling to the floor. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Wu stumbled back, only to realize the other corpses were moving too. Some twitched, some dragged themselves across the blood-soaked floor, their empty eyes filled with rage and pain. Then, they spoke. "Wu, you owe us your life. It's time to pay." Their voices were a deep, guttural chorus, an unholy echo from beyond the grave. Suddenly, the ground beneath Wu collapsed into a churning pit of blood. He fell. The icy blood swallowed him, creeping up his throat, into his nostrils. He struggled, kicking wildly, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank. His arms stiffened, his skin itched, then burned. Coarse bristles burst from his flesh. He gasped, but the sound that left his throat was no longer human. A pig's squeal echoed through the abyss. He tried to scream, but all that came out was a terrified pig's squeal. And then, darkness. Wu woke up with a start, gasping for breath. His body was drenched in cold sweat. But something was wrong. A foul metallic smell lingered in the air. His eyes darted upward. Dark red droplets were dripping from the ceiling onto his bed. His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but his voice had left him. His heart pounded as he reached out hesitantly, touching the bloodstain on his blanket. He blinked. The stain was gone. The ceiling was clean. Nothing was there. But he knew. It had begun. From that night on, Wu's life unraveled into madness. Every night, the sound of dripping blood echoed through his house. Every night he heard the mournful wails of pigs in his courtyard, though no animals remained. The stray dogs that used to roam his slaughterhouse no longer barked. They simply stared at him, their eyes reflecting something unnatural. And then, his body began to change. His hands, his once strong, steady hands began to darken, rot, and peel, the skin cracking like dried leather. His fingernails curled and hardened, yellowing into something grotesque. They no longer looked human. The stench of decay clung to him. When he went to a local physician, the man took one look and recoiled. "Wu, this isn't a disease. You need a priest, not a doctor." Wu was finally afraid. Desperate, Wu ran to the temple, falling to his knees before the old monk he had once mocked. His face was gaunt, his body frail, his once powerful hands wrapped in filthy rags to hide their monstrous state. Tears streamed down his face. "Master, help me. I think I'm cursed." The old monk looked at him for a long time before sighing. "The debts of blood must be paid in blood." Wu trembled. "No, please tell me what to do. I will do anything." The monk's eyes were filled with quiet sorrow. "The weight of your sins is already upon you. If you truly wish for mercy, cast aside the blade, release all living creatures, and repent with all your heart." Wu clung to those words like a drowning man grasping at reeds. That day, he buried his butcher's knife. He released the animals he had left. He offered food to the hungry. He prayed, night after night, begging for forgiveness. But karma does not forget. It was far too late. Wu's body withered. His once muscled frame became a walking corpse, his flesh decaying before his eyes. People avoided him. Even the stray dogs that had once howled outside his house now fled at the sight of him. And then, one night, he could bear it no longer. He sat in his courtyard, wrapped in a tattered cloth, staring at the moon with empty, sunken eyes. "Why?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. The wind was silent. Then, a shadow moved in the darkness. He looked up. There, in the moonlit yard, stood a pig. But not just any pig. It was staring at him. Its eyes were human. A shudder ran through Wu's body. He tried to look away, but something held him still. The pig opened its mouth and spoke. "Wu, it's time." At dawn, the neighbors found Wu's body. He was dead in the pigsty. His face twisted in horror, his mouth frozen mid-scream, his lifeless eyes bulging wide, as if he had seen something too terrible to comprehend. But what shocked them most was his hands. They had completely transformed into hooves, blackened, shriveled, unnatural, as if he was already becoming one of them. Word spread. The butcher has been taken to the animal realm. His next life will be as a pig. That night, from the abandoned slaughterhouse, a pig's cry split the air. Long, high-pitched, unnatural. It dragged on, rattling through the silent town. It was the cry of a pig, but it carried the echoes of a man. From the temple, the old monk sat in meditation, beads slipping through his fingers. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. Namo Amitabha Buddha. Karma never forgets. Wu's story became a legend, whispered among Buddhist followers and ordinary folk alike. His life of slaughter, his eerie downfall, his inescapable fate, a warning to all who hear it. In this world, every action has a consequence. Every debt will be repaid. As the Buddha once said, cause and effect never fail. The time may not yet have come, but when it does, no one can escape.